Director of Government Affairs at Amtrak.
I think you just gave me a promotion.
Well, she'll do that. So you're the Assistant Director?
Senior Manager.
Senior Manager, okay.
That's all just titles. I just work at Amtrak.
He worked at Amtrak since 2007, responsible for legislative and policy maker outreach communications for the Midwest. His 15-state territory spans an area from North Dakota to Ohio, Michigan, and Arkansas. In building relationships with state legislators and local officials, he stresses the role that a robust passenger rail system can play in fostering greater mobility, increasing economic linkages between communities, and offering diverse travelers a viable alternative to congested roads and expensive air travel. He's brought his expertise in rail policy and transportation to his service on the Iowa Passenger Rail Advisory Council, Minnesota Passenger Rail Council, Minnesota Governor's Freight Rail Council. He came to Amtrak from the Chicago Transit Authority, where his major visitor and group marketing and instituted initiatives that contributed to increases in transit ridership. Prior to CTA, he handled media relations and government affairs for the U.S.-based divisions of the Canadian National Railway. And where'd you go to school there?
University of Iowa.
Oh,
Please don't hold it against me.
no, it's not quite a Roots, Wisconsin, but it's close. So let's welcome Derrick.
Thank you. All right, thank you. You hit the spike on the head. I actually don't need to say anything because you really drove home some important points. And that is that support for passenger rail can be bipartisan, and in many places it is. And again, the actions of the last Congress have made that fairly evident. And certainly in many of the states that I deal with, support for rail is bipartisan. And the message that I carry is just that it's not about the trains themselves, but what the trains give us is better mobility. It gives us an economic development tool, especially as many of our smaller and our rural communities and our smaller communities are dealing with changes in the economy. How do we continue to make our community places where people want to invest, where people want to live? And having high quality transportation is one of those things. And so that's especially the message that I carry to legislators to justify the use of your taxpayer dollars, because that's what we're looking to do, is to use your tax dollars to build a system and to provide a system that will contribute to a better economy for us and for our kids and our grandkids. So what you will see here this morning, and it's probably going to be a little bit of rehash for you guys because you know a lot about us. This is the presentation that I gave just this week to 10 members and staff in the Wisconsin legislature over in Madison. Because of the governor's budget, Governor Evers' budget proposal, we have stepped up our efforts in reaching out to legislators in Madison. And especially those legislators along the existing Empire Builder route, the Hiawatha route, and the folks up in Superior who could get Northern Lights Express service, to talk to them about what Amtrak is, what Amtrak has done, and the role that the state needs to play if passenger rail will play a greater role in the economy and the mobility for the citizens in Wisconsin. So I, in essence, have to kind of start from fresh and tell them about what Amtrak, how Amtrak was founded, created by Congress to take over the operations of the passenger network from what were previously freight and passenger railroads, how many miles. I talk about the route network, how many places we serve, how many trains, how that has grown over time, at least in terms of the number of trains, if not necessarily the route network. I point out to them the distinction between long distance trains, state-supported trains, and the Northeast Corridor. To the public, those distinctions don't mean anything. A train is a train. But from a policy perspective, the distinction is very important. And it looks like this has a laser. Oh, that's cool. So I point out the distinction between the long distance network, which depending on where I am and who I'm talking to, may be what folks are most familiar with. Amtrak is different to people depending on where they are in the United States. Amtrak takes on a very local flavor, even though we're a national network. So with legislators in Wisconsin, if they're from places along the Empire Builder route, they know the long distance network. If they're from Milwaukee or from Racine or Kenosha County, they know the Hiawatha service. So I talk about the long distance network, which are in light blue, the Empire Builder, California Zephyr, Southwest Chief. And then I talk about the state supported network in the dark blue lines, like the Cascades here, the Hiawathas, the Empire Service, the Downeaster, the Heartland Flyer, the San Diego, and the San Joaquin. How was that? I could do really well in a quiz. And then the Northeast Corridor. And I talk about sort of the financial distinctions between those two. And some legislators, again, they may carry the baggage of, oh, Amtrak is this money losing black hole, and we're pouring this money into all these trains that nobody's riding anymore. So I talk to them about the ridership and the finances, and helps them kind of understand the nuances of rail. Oh, just pointed that, shouldn't I? Then I show them this. I talk to them about how prior to 1970, the number of people who were riding passenger trains was falling. It had fallen off the cliff with the advent of interstate highways that were financed with public investment, and the Civil Aeronautics Administration, and the investment in planes, and how changing technology changed the travel for Americans. But by consolidating all the operation of passenger rail and management and marketing into Amtrak, created a team of folks who were specifically dedicated to growing ridership on the passenger rail network. We've seen an increase in ridership. So up to almost 32 million people last year on basically the same network. I talked to them about the operating funding level. Again, there's this perception that Amtrak loses so much money. Sure, there is a public investment that's required to sustain the system, but we have becoming more and more efficient over time. You know, back in the mid-2000s, 10 years ago, we were losing almost $1 billion on our operations every year. Now I need to update this slide, but now we've driven that down to, in the just completed fiscal year 2018, our operating loss was $168 million. So we've gone from $900 million down to $168 million. And except for a couple of incidents that happened last year, we would have been under 100 million. So our CEO today and our board of directors, we are tasked with bringing the operating loss within the next 2 to 3 years down to zero. Now granted, again, I have to nuance the explanation depending on the audience that I'm with. Arun at Wisconsin DOT knows that we consider the money that you taxpayers of Wisconsin pay us to run the Hiawathas as revenue to Amtrak. So the actual subsidy may be greater, but what this is really a description of is the federal operating support. So we wouldn't be operating the Hiawathas without the contribution and without the contract with Arun and the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. In essence, the improved performance that we've been showing in terms of growing ridership, in terms of reducing the operating support, has led to the appropriations wins that we've had the last few years in Congress. Improved relations on Capitol Hill. They see us becoming more efficient, doing more with fewer employees, that they have felt competent to appropriate to us over the last couple of years $1.9 billion that we use primarily to invest in the Capitol, but $168 million last year we used to actually subsidize the operations of the system. So our goal, as I indicated, was to drive that operating support from the U.S. Congress down to zero in 2 to 3 years. We will always still need capital funding. There's not as much political opposition to receiving capital funding to invest in the system, like building a new tunnel under the Hudson, like rehabbing stations like we're doing here in Portage and like we just finished in Toma. There's no problem with that. They see that as a wise expenditure of taxpayer resources, like fixing up I-39 or R-94 or making sure that the runways at Dane County Airport are smooth. So we'll still need that, and they understand that, and they seem to be willing to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more about not just the money that's coming to Amtrak in terms of capital dollars, but there are now federal grant dollars federal grant programs that are being funded such that states like Wisconsin can tap into to match with local money to do even more projects. I talked to them about the mega regions and about Amtrak's new or enhanced focus on developing services, multi-frequent services over corridors of 100 to 500 miles, because we feel that's the sweet spot for passenger rail. That's where we can get most of the customers. The long distance train network will hopefully always play a role. You guys have a role in making sure you impress that upon members of Congress that network is important. but we know that the majority, that rail can really be competitive with the highway and the airplane when we can provide frequent service that's on time and competitive with the car on distances that are 100 to 500 miles. And so these are the places where America is growing, the different mega regions. I mean, here's the one we love, the Great Lakes region there. I can see Madison there, I can see the Fox cities with Green Bay, there's the Twin Cities, St. Louis. So it's these sorts of regions, connecting them with frequent trains, because that's where lots of people are, that's what's going to do really well. And that's what will really make Amtrak so critical to the American public, that getting the operating or the capital support that we need will becoming even easier. I showed them, to stress the importance of frequent service, I showed them the Hiawatha timetable. And they can see how there are multiple trains throughout the day, and that makes the Hiawatha service so incredibly popular. We just broke a record, a release that you guys may have seen. I think we carried 858,000 people last year on the Hiawatha service. I won't talk any more about that because I don't want to steal Arun's thunder, because I'm sure he's going to talk about the Hiawathas. I talk about how communities have spent their local resources, matched them with state and federal resources to build new train stations. So we've got new and renovated train stations that are going up all over the country. Those are intermodal stations where we're bringing together intercity bus, local bus, rental cars, bike share, to really turn the train station into an economic driver of the communities in which they exist. The train station, a really relevant, well-used train station can be like having an airport right in the center of your downtown. And we know if we want to revive our local communities, having ease of access for folks of all ages to get to the community, having a quality train station to begin or end your trip is really critical. I talk about how quality transportation drives investment. In my town, we have seen many headquarters relocations to within just blocks of the train station, because having high quality train service, be it intercity rail or commuter rail, is important for the business community today. How our work is going to get to their workplaces, how is the talent going to get to, they want to be where the talent is, and the talent wants to be where there's good quality transportation. Normal, Illinois is an example of a community that's invested in their rail station and adopted supportive zoning around the station to encourage high-density development, to take advantage of the car-free access that the Amtrak station affords them. That's the Amtrak station there on the left, and that's the crowd that was there for the opening. You can see barely an Amtrak train in the background. Normal is served by 10 trains a day, with the Illinois DOT having an ultimate goal of taking that up to, I think, 18 trains a day at Normal, Illinois. So, and to help the legislators feel more comfortable, I show them this list of other states around the country that are investing with Amtrak, that Amtrak has partnerships with 21 authorities in 18 different states to provide additional passenger rail service over and above the network that we operate every day. About half of all Amtrak customers are riding on a passenger train on any day that would not be operating except for the contract that we have with the state. So about 15 million customers are on state-supported trains. So to those folks, Amtrak is a corridor train similar to the Hiawatha service. It's not the overnight long-distance train. Those states, again, I talked about the states actually pay us to operate those services. Those states paid us, I think it was about $270 million, and that generated $521 million in ticket revenue. Different states have different philosophies about pricing. Some states want us to keep the fares low to encourage travel by train. Illinois is one of those states. Other states want us to be aggressive with fares to earn as much money as we can to charge what the market will bear, if you will, to reduce the state operating support. Michigan is an example of one of those states. Of course, you guys are all familiar with the what we call the TCMC, the Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago second frequency on the Empire Builder route. For legislators who don't have the map of the Amtrak system in their head, this slide I think is useful to them. They can see all of the communities that would be positively impacted, and I hope that in my previous discussion I explained to them how important that frequent service is. 1 train a day is just a novelty item. It's when you get above that to 2 trains a day, 3 trains a day, 4 trains a day is when you become a key player in the transportation system. That's when you get the business community interested. And it's very important for us who are advocating for this additional service to reach out to our contacts in our local business communities. Because again, having high quality rail service at Portage or at La Crosse or at Columbus makes those places more attractive places to do business. And helps those communities retain the talent and attract new residents, because so many folks, it may not be their first decision about where they live. It's probably schools and safety, but transportation is playing more and more of a role of when not only people but businesses are making locational decisions. Here's John talked about the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Network. There's the Midwest. That basically is my territory. I have to stay on top of what the legislatures are doing in all of those states. It doesn't include one state that I have here, Arkansas. I don't know why they gave me Arkansas, but I spend time in Little Rock as well. The blue lines roughly represent the existing Amtrak network. The green lines represent the routes that would be enhanced or new routes per the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission or the Midwest Regional Rail System. Again, I talked to them, I already sort of covered this about Amtrak services within the state of Wisconsin. Again, sort of a drill down there. I also talked to them about the Northern Lights Express, which is really on this map here. The state of Minnesota and a coalition of counties along that route, as you guys know, have over the last more than 10 years put together a plan, a full-fledged plan, to develop new passenger rail service on that route, which last had service back in the early 1980s. The corridor would have 4 trains a day each way over BNSF Railway and operate at speeds up to 90 miles per hour. I think there would be 5 stations. They have taken it almost all the way through the environmental process to the point that they have received what's called a finding of no significant impact from the federal government, meaning that they have environmental clearance to proceed with final design and implementation of the service. So in addition to spending a lot of time in Madison, I'm spending a lot of time in St. Paul, talking to groups like you and to business folks to help them understand the role and what they can do to help bring about passenger rail service. The governor of Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz, who was the congressman for this district down here, so he already had Amtrak service. He has requested both bonding appropriation in his budget request to the Minnesota legislature in support of between TCMC service as well as the NLX service. So I've been stressing to legislators in Madison that the money that Governor Evers is requesting is part of a partnership that would be developed with Minnesota and with the federal government, so that money would be multiplied in terms of the relationship and the money that would come from other entities to actually get the TCM service and the Hiawatha expansion up and running. This is Wisconsin's, our vision for the future in Wisconsin. Again, Chicago to Milwaukee service, the Hiawathas, go from 7 round trips a day to 10 round trips a day. The TCMC, the Twin Cities Milwaukee second train. Again, these are the priorities that we're working on with Wisconsin DOT to get these implemented for the state, for the citizens of Wisconsin. And here are some examples of some other new services around the country that are in various stages of implementation. The first one that I've listed here is establishing a new corridor between Chicago and the Quad Cities. The Quad Cities of Illinois and Iowa have about 400,000 people, and it's one of the largest regions in the country without Amtrak passenger rail service. The state of Iowa and Illinois received a grant from the federal government about 8 years or so ago to implement this service. Of course, we've got 3 additional round trips on the Hiawatha service. We've got the TCMC, and then we've got the Northern Lights Express, all of great concern and hopefully enthusiasm here among you folks. Then we're working with the state of Kansas on extending the Heartland Flyer service, which runs from Oklahoma City to Fort Worth. We want to extend that north to meet up with an existing route in Newton, Kansas, to basically reestablish a route that used to exist years ago on the old Texas Chief. The state of Colorado has been really happy with the Winter Express that we've been running, and they've been very helpful with us, helpful on the Southwest Chief issues. So they're stepping up, and we're beginning discussions with them on establishing a brand new corridor along what's called the Front Range from Cheyenne, Wyoming, down to Pueblo and Colorado Springs, Colorado. That area of the state is growing dramatically, and I-25 is under a lot of pressure. There are other cities on that corridor, including Fort Collins and Boulder and Colorado Springs. We've had great success in the state of Virginia. We've established new service from Roanoke to Washington, D.C. With a second train just added. Between Seattle and Portland, we hope to, by the end of the year, go ahead and complete the implementation of 2 additional round trips to add to the existing 4 between Seattle and Portland. And then the Gulf Coast service, we've been working really hard to get an appropriation out of the state of Mississippi of around $14 million to match with federal funds and Alabama funds to reestablish service between New Orleans and Mobile, just this segment right here. We think we've got a win in the state of Mississippi, and then advocates have really geared up to push for resumption of service between Chicago, Galena, and Dubuque. By the way, any questions at all? Please feel free to chime in. It doesn't have to be about all me talking. Yes, this gentleman over here. How are you again?
Pretty good. Why is it I don't ever see Madison on this? Is there any incentive for bringing the train through Madison, Wisconsin?
I will say that we... Maybe I feel like Arun should answer that question. This is my... I'll tell you this. Amtrak, as federal legislation on passenger rail has evolved, the responsibility for planning the network has really been devolved to the states. And so we are a contractor for Wisconsin DOT, and so we kind of adhere to their priorities. And so right now, the priorities are, let's work on the Hiawathas, let's get those up and running, and then let's get us a second train, and then maybe we can build further from there. We kind of need you guys, the citizens of the state of Wisconsin, same answer. Yeah, it's up to, again, we work at the behest of the DOT, and if you guys want the map to look differently, you need to let policymakers know you want the map to look different.
Make one suggestion on your slide.
Sure.
MnDOT, the one that shows all the connections, I forget which one it was.
This.
Yeah, that one. We have MnDOT's endorsed as part of our plan to go from the Twin Cities down through Des Moines to Kansas City. I don't
Okay.
see that on your slide, just an
Well,
FYI.
this is the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission map.
Oh, so they're not, they must not be aware of that, is that what you're thinking?
Thank you for the suggestion. I will double check with my contacts at MIPRIC as to what the map should look like. Just thank you for that. You said that's MnDOT that has, have they changed?
Yes.
Well, see, here's the thing. This doesn't reflect the Minnesota State Rail Plan. The Minnesota State Rail Plan has a lot more tentacles on it than this.
Yeah, well, that was a big one for us. For us, it's a big one.
Okay.
Just an FYI.
All right, thank you. And I've seen that. And on that vein, I did talk with them a little bit about some of the federal grant programs that exist. In addition to the appropriation that Amtrak gets every year, including the last year, $1.9 billion, just signed into law by President Trump a couple of months ago, there are also several grant programs that were funded by the Congress that are considered competitive grants, that the states, if they've got a project, they can apply for the grant to help pay for the project. It usually, it always requires a federal match, so that the state taxpayers or the state legislature has to appropriate dollars to match with the federal funds they're going after. And in many cases, Amtrak is now in a position where we are providing some matching dollars too to help move the project along. So again, this was to drive home the point that the dollars that the state of Wisconsin would appropriate, there's the potential for it to be expanded further by matching it with federal dollars. So by not acting as a state, you're actually leaving money out there on the table for projects that are perceived on a national level as being very important projects, very valuable projects. Chicago-Milwaukee and Chicago-Milwaukee Twin Cities is perceived as being a corridor that has great potential to have lots of passenger rail traffic. It connects three very dynamic cities along a corridor that's just about the right mileage. It's got the right demographics. So the feds, I think, are very interested in partnering with the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin on this project. All that's needed is for the states to step up with some local funding and to start advancing the projects. So first was the federal-state partnership for a state of good repair. Again, it was authorized by the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. The key here is that the appropriation was $400 million for this particular grant program. So again, available for states to go out and actually to apply for dollars to actually rehab track, get the train service up and running. The other one was the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Act, also called CRISI, for the fiscal year 19, which we're in right now, appropriated at $255 million. And then there's the Restoration and Enhancement Grants. Not too much appropriated into this one this year. Again, stuff happens behind the scenes in Congress that I'm not always familiar with. Only $5 million. This grant is actually for routes that used to have Amtrak service that was discontinued. So only certain routes are eligible for this. So obviously Twin Cities to Duluth is one of those routes that used to have Amtrak service that was discontinued. And then the biggie is the BUILD program. Used to be called Tiger. It's now building, better utilizing investments to leverage development. And this is not just for rail projects, this is for all transportation projects. Highway, urban transit. It has an interesting stipulation that the funding divide has to be half rural, half urban. So that's a benefit to a route, I think, like the Empire Builder route, because again, it serves so many rural communities. And in the fiscal year which we're in now, Congress funded that at $900 million. I will gladly take any additional questions. Yes, sir.
When the state-owned equipment, had the Amtrak personnel running it, or?
Running it, you mean as in locomotive engineers and conductors? Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes, Gary, I mentioned before.
The TCMC and the 3 additional Hiawatha's all go through Glenview, Illinois, and I understand there's significant opposition there. I was wondering how serious that is.
It's very serious opposition. I think the state of Illinois has indicated that they're not going to, and we're in a governor's transition right now in the state of Illinois, that they're not going to move forward until the citizens feel like they've been made whole. So I think some consultants, and Arun, you can check me on any of this. I think the consultants that are tasked to help develop this project are coming up with some new scenarios to try and meet, or to try and mollify the concerns of the citizens in that area. Yes?
Why is Amtrak always being beaten up in the media and by politicians, and it seems like they just lay down and take it, regarding subsidies? And the highways and the airports get massive subsidies and nobody, gives a whimper.
Boy, that could be a whole other presentation.
Well, a follow-up on that is that when you showed your slide about the decreasing federal operating aids, that was for railroads. What if you were to scale it and put highways and air travel on the same graph and keep reminding people that Amtrak is the only mode that's got this burden of having to pay, the passengers have to pay it all, even though there are substantial social benefits, which is exactly why we subsidize, why we publicly invest in biking, walking, roads, airports, and seaports.
I agree with you. We actually, I have at times, we do have a slide that shows the level of federal investments in the various modes over time, and the rail investment is this little tiny line all the way down here, and then highways and aviation are literally up here. I mean, it actually shows the scale. And the only time there's been a really big bump in rail was in 2008. Remember the stimulus program? Everything bumped up like that, and then it kind of started to trail down. It's higher now. I guess I would ask you this question, and again, I talked about how people's perception of rail is oftentimes very localized. I know that you guys have some pretty active and listen to radio personalities here that we don't hear in Chicago. So when you say that we're getting beat up, is that what you're referring to? Is that there's a spotlight kind of placed on rail because of the election, and you've got some media that's doing that? Or
That's certainly been true in the past.
okay.
Media.
Yeah, we have up in Milwaukee, we have Jeff Wagner, and WTMJ is very negative on Amtrak, and every time they bring up on the Amtrak and also on the what they call the HOP, and everything like that,
The new
light
streetcar? Sure.
and everything like that. And I've called up Jeff a couple of times and whatever, and these people have never, a lot of these people that call in have never been on a train, and Jeff Wagner's never been on a train, and everything like that in years, and everything like that, and that goes down to our state's representatives like Robin Boss, who's just about torpedoed every chance we've ever had to get us up to Milwaukee, or he was one of the main culprits of not letting us get the telephone trains, and also he took the food and beverage service off the Hiawatha service about 6 years ago. And so a lot of times these social people that are on the radio do make a tremendous difference on what people think about the state of Wisconsin. And also they were very possibly helped torpedo this thing with the service going from Madison to Milwaukee also.
Was that, I gotta ask you, is that a radio person?
Yes.
Okay. I am from Minnesota. One of the points that I'll talk about this afternoon, LD, and I'm sorry, I'm going to respond to your question too, is in Minnesota, I think we've changed the climate. It took a lot of work. I personally think we are not controlling the media in the sense of the positive tone towards passenger rail. Are there exceptions? Yes, but we have chosen to ignore
Yep.
those people. I hate to say those people, that sounds horrible, but anyone who is
Our
not,
opponents, we've chosen to ignore.
or irrational people, it doesn't really matter. If they are rational people, and I'll be talking about one of the senators this afternoon, but except, we have one of a huge exception. On Wednesday in the Strip, we had a half-page editorial against the NLX, the Northern Express train to Duluth, and so we immediately contacted Ken Bueller, who was front-running that out of Duluth, so we were going to respond to that. But except for that, it's been all positive in the last, I'd say, 2 years.
I think the
But it
key
takes
is
a
to
work to
find.
get over that hump.
Yeah, I think the key is there are a couple of things to do, is to build coalitions.
Correct.
With other organizations whose interests align with yours.
That's right.
So that's folks in the local business community, that's the cycling community, that's the environmental community. There are other entities that are out there, and then also to build relationships in the business community, because the folks who are kind of, I mean, we spend too much time sort of listening to the loudest person in the room, and sometimes the loudest person in the room doesn't really, we know, a lot of people know that they don't know what they're talking about. And it would be very difficult for us to, let's not get too bent out of shape about those folks and start building the coalitions behind the scene, and quietly having discussions with folks, and making your case, being reasonable, not yelling and screaming, as was indicated, and I think that goes a long way towards helping to sort of mute that opposition. I mean, because remember, we are still making progress. Sure, we were set back here in Wisconsin for 8 years, but the state just got a grant to build a new platform at the Milwaukee Airport Rail Station. So we're going to be seeing some improvements there.
And real quick comment to tag on, you made a comment, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward or whatever, that's kind of what we've been doing.
Yeah.
And the classic example was the Rochester route. Had a lot of NIMBY people that were really kind of bizarre in my opinion, but we chose to ignore it. This is what our organization, because it's so draining on our members, and when they talk about it, it's really a drain.
Well, when
And-
you give them attention, it just keeps it going.
That's right, it keeps it going in the wrong direction, so we totally ignored that. So it's been pretty positive and we've met, just like you just said, with tourism directors, chambers, city managers, mayors, along especially the
I work with an incredible group of people who love trains and love what they do and try valiantly to make the service as pleasant and as usable as possible. We just work in an extremely different environment in a United States that makes it hard for us to get done in a context. It's difficult, and there are many things that we would like to do, but it's just very difficult to accomplish them. In terms of the connections between Hiawatha service and Lincoln service, did we not fix some of that with the recent timetable change?
Yeah, I can
Okay.
give a quick update on that. So a little bit of background, the states have been working, Midwest states have been working together, Midwest Regional Rail Initiative for years. And with the arrival of this joint state-owned Midwest equipment, the states got together and said, okay, we need to stop talking about it and study and really start implementing a regional service. So we went to Amtrak and said, we want Amtrak Midwest on these new locomotives. We want our Midwest state-supported routes to function more as a network. We want a new website that hosted by Amtrak, that's called Amtrak Midwest. But most importantly, we want improved connections between the services that are operating now. And last year, I believe, we worked with Amtrak and we got changes to connections between the Hiawatha and Wolverine, the Hiawatha and the Lincoln service, and they're not perfect yet, but significantly improved connections on some of those connections, and we're going to keep doing it as Michigan is going to be reducing their schedule. We've asked Amtrak to keep it high on their priority list to make sure that they're connecting with Hiawatha and the other trains, and they're working with Michigan on that schedule. And similarly with the Lincoln service, they're going to see a reduction in travel time with speed increases. You can see it's going. And we want them to do the same thing with that. So that it has been an issue that's been talked about, and it's really been Midwest states that have gotten together and said, we got to think of this as a regional network for states that are trains now.
And to that end as well, we have a team of folks within Amtrak that works on developing intermodal connections. We aggressively go after relationships with intercity bus carriers to see where we can have them change their schedules to meet our trains at our stations and have interline ticketing. A slide that I use from time to time, and this was sort of an aha moment for me last year, was that we have about 500 stations that have passenger train service in the U.S. We have 499 additional places that are on the Amtrak network through our throughway bus network. So in essence, almost 1,000 places that you can get to using Amtrak or its interline carriers. At Chicago Union Station, I don't know how many have been there recently, but we just finished a $22 million project to redo the plaster, the paint, and the skylight in the old head house itself. As many of you know, the station is in 2 pieces. There's the head house and there's the concourse. The concourse is not done. The concourse needs a lot of work. There is a plan to dramatically improve the concourse by adding additional entrances and exits, by improving the ventilation, and by opening up the spaces for a freer flow of passenger traffic. That work is waiting on an agreement with Metro, who is the majority user of the concourse. Our leadership will not spend solely our money on improving the concourse without the participation of the majority user of the concourse. That's just prudent financially. And once we do have that agreement with Metro, then we have been in talks with our congressional delegation. They know that we're going to go after federal funds to actually totally redo the concourse so that it is a much more pleasant experience, as pleasant as it can be since the Penn Central knocked down the building. We got services that we're operating out of Union Station under contract for 4 different states. Each state is looking out for its own best interests. And we also have to be mindful of turning equipment, crew use and crew rest, and time slots on railroads. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into play when it comes to changing a train schedule. So it's not, it's not as easy. What would be easier is if we had more trains on every route, then the connection issue wouldn't be as much of a challenge. So that's why the goal needs to be increasing frequencies, because that makes your connections easier. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm a student up at St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. My family lives in Wisconsin Dells. I regularly take Amtrak back home to school.
Thank you for your visit.
5 to 6 times a semester. And I guess my question I have is, with the additional train, is there any hope of, I know it's a short distance train, but having something like the dining car experience where you have, when I've taken, I've encouraged a lot of my friends who've never ridden the train to take them home from school, and a lot of them have. And a lot of them have expressed the train's late a lot of times, which bothers them, but what makes them want to take it again is the experience. And I know for myself, as well as a lot of my friends that have taken it, is the experience of being able to go and get a meal, and the friendly staff and the people who work on the train are what make us repeat.
Warming my heart.
So I guess that's what I ask is there any hope to do that on the second train? Because that's what has made me and people my age, see I'm the youngest person in the room right now, but that's what is making my generation repeat customers of Amtrak. The on-time performance would be nice, but in spite of that, it's that experience that we get when we ride a train that makes us want to ride it again.
No, I appreciate your comments on that, and they mean a lot. I would say we have a team within Amtrak, and as you guys know, we have a new leadership team at Amtrak, and they brought in a lot of new folks. And one of the things that we are really looking at is the food service that we provide, and how do we do it in a sort of contemporary, modern way. Yet it still distinguishes us from other carriers, but is done in sort of a financially prudent way. I can almost guarantee you that that when we get the second train, and we will all be successful in pulling this off, I very likely will not have a traditional dining car like you're accustomed to on the Empire Builder, but it probably won't have a service very much like the cafe cars either. So this is something that we're constantly evolving to try and figure out what it is that the public likes. Because as much as we love the traditional dining car service with tablecloths and used to be glass flatware, who eats like that at home anymore? So, and then there's a lot of cost that comes along with that. So know that we are paying a lot of attention to it, and as the year rolls on, you're going to be seeing more and more news about how we plan to deliver the food service. The good thing about the second train is it will be a train that originates in St. Paul, and as those of you who follow this know, we give grades to the freight railroads every year on their on-time performance, and the Canadian Pacific is our only A railroad. So the Hiawathas run at a, what, 93, 95% on time, and so the second train would be an entirely Canadian Pacific train, like our Montrealer. We have a couple of other services. We fully expect that this would be a high-performing train in terms of on-time performance.
Do you want to say anything about freight train interference, the Supreme Court lawsuit, capital programs to remove bottlenecks or anything like that?
What I want you to take away, in addition to talking to your state legislators about the governor's appropriation and how much you want the second train and the Hiawathas and the NLX, I want you to take to your congressional delegation. That means Senator Baldwin, Senator Johnson, and whoever your congressman is, that the freight railroads need to be held to task to make Amtrak trains run on time. They have there are contracts that they are not abiding by, and that it is leading to losses of customers and to financial losses, please hold the freight railroads accountable. When we take our reauthorization proposal to Congress in the fall, it will include ideas on how we can better work with the freight railroads, things that we think would be handy in terms of getting them to dispatch our trains with more precision. So that's all I'd like to say.
Let's give Derrick our